In this set of videos, we're going to be looking at a few team-based practices and mindsets to help us learn from the difficult stuff, the challenges, the mistakes, in order to improve the workplace culture and ultimately create safer spaces for our patients. In complex systems like neonatal wards, no amount of planning or policy is going to prevent every mistake. Things will go wrong because we cannot control every variable in the way that we want to, because we're not superhuman. Now that obviously can be really hard because we really care about this work and you're working with newborns and their families. And so when things go wrong, it's incredibly difficult, but it's so much more difficult when people throw blame around. But blame is really human. And there's a few reasons we do it. So one, blame reduces our own emotional stress. It gives us a sense of causality and control. And it actually reduces complex problems into a single individual or team. All of this is quite reassuring. There's two issues with this. Firstly, it's not true. Most issues in complex healthcare emerge from a range of factors way more complex than a single individual. So blaming is way too simple and therefore inaccurate, and means that we don't actually understand what's gone wrong. Secondly, blame shames. Blame makes us more afraid of addressing issues and raising concerns for fear that we're going to look bad. And the result of that is actually the creation of more mistakes because it makes learning and opening up things that aren't working way less likely. Now, across the NHS, this is going to be addressed in something called PSIRF, which is the Patient Safety Incident Response Framework that's being rolled out across England. It's a really promising framework. It's about learning from safety issues in a much more compassionate way. But a good framework is much more likely to be successful in cultures that can support it. So let's look at what we can do to reduce that blame and increase the kind of learning that happens. So a big part of PSIRF is compassion. Being treated compassionately shows us that we're cared for even when something goes wrong. But in your context, there are a few basics we need to put in place for that compassion to really come through and be authentic. Now, the first thing here is the recognition that mistakes are inevitable and the result of complex systems. Another way of framing that might just be mistakes are human. There is no foolproof way of doing your job. You're dealing with complex issues in a stretched system. And so when mistakes happen, I just want to really reiterate, they aren't the result of an individual or a person being a bad person. They're often because of patterns of overwork, because of training gaps, because of unnoticed technological areas, because of funding, and so on and so forth. So except in those very rare cases of actual malice, one individual is not to blame. And this has to be understood and normalized by teams in order to make us more accepting, not just of other people, but of ourselves as well. Because if we can be more accepting of those complexities, we're going to actually find it a lot easier to make space for learning and not rush into blame. So ask yourself, how does your team deal with and think about those kinds of mistakes? To what extent do you tend to blame either yourself or the individuals around you when things go wrong? And to what extent could you be more generous and take in that complexity and nuance that is actually the reality of your working environment? A really useful thing that teams can do, very similar to gratitude, is making space for those opportunities to praise people. Again, a reminder that they're valued even if some things aren't working. It makes people feel safer, feel liked. But actually, in this case, it creates a really important balance, because if the only feedback you're getting is critical, and if that's the general feedback a team is getting, you're going to create a defensive environment, which is one where people are shutting down and they're angsty and they're more worried about getting things wrong than working in ways that do things right. So by having a space in which praise is more common, you're actually going to have better conversations around the difficult things because people feel more assured and safe overall. So praise is all well and good, but when things are going wrong, of course, you're going to have to deal with people who are being defensive and not wanting to maybe reflect really critically on what they might have done, especially about a job they care deeply about, and they want to know that they're going to be okay. So the other thing we need to do is when we have these safety incidents that come up or issues that are emerging, we need to make sure that the conversations are framed supportively. So it's not, we want to work out what's gone wrong here, because that's quite a blame-centered framework. It's, we want to improve what we do so we can be as safe as possible. Or we want to learn as much as possible so you don't have to feel like this. Now, sometimes it's worth referencing the fact that when things go wrong, everybody feels really rubbish. And so bringing that kind of recognition of that feeling is a really supportive thing to do. It's empathetic, and it will change how someone engages in that conversation. So framing it supportively. The other thing we can do, similar to praise, kind of combining those two things, is make sure we are learning from what goes well and not just the failures. So much learning is lost because we only pay attention when the alarm bell rings. Now, not only does that put us in the defense mode, when we're always looking for the threats and the risks, it actually means we're missing out on so many of the things that really improve outcomes for patients and for staff. So the positives of how you communicate, the ways in which you cover for each other, the ways in which you make space for doing things differently when there's a sudden influx of high-need patients, whatever it is. Learning from the stuff you're doing well tells you what you can do more of positively rather than just avoid stuff out of fear. So if, for example, at the moment you're only debriefing when things go wrong, you are creating a negative learning space because a debrief becomes associated with all those problematic issues. And that means you're missing out on vital information to improve outcomes. With those things in mind, have a think about who today you can go and give a bit of praise to, whether there's any places you could make some space to learn from what is working and what isn't. And finally, where you might come across something difficult, where might that be happening in your work right now, how would you frame that kind of conversation supportively? Reflecting on these makes space for more compassion in your day-to-day work.